Right, got it. Hey, central themes in Sefer Bereshis we've been looking at for a while. What I'd like to do today is have a bit of a closer look at the origins of Avraham Avinu, because Avraham Avinu is without doubt the cornerstone of Sefer Bereshis. Once Avraham Avinu begins his life's work of teaching emunah to whoever he can find and practicing chesed, that is really the first major turning point in the spiritual history of the world. And therefore the Torah really dedicates only 11 chapters to pre-Avraham Avinu, telling us basically about the creation of the world, Adam and Eve, Cain and Hevel, and the flood. And it's all done very, very quickly. Only when we start coming to Avraham Avinu do we start getting detailed accounts of who he meets and dialogue and activities of his. And the reason for that is because prior, and this is a very important point to bear in mind when you're reading the Chumash, and that is, of course, there are millions of things that happen not recorded in the Chumash. The Chumash has a very specific goal in mind, and that is, if you like, the spiritual history of the world. And that's relevant to what we're going to be learning today. I'd like to today learn a little bit more in depth some material out from the Sefer HaKuzari. So maybe a few minutes of introduction are appropriate here. The book of the Kuzari was written by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi about 900 years ago in the golden age of Spain. At a time when Spain was the center very much of Jewish life, certainly Sephardi Jewish life. There were, of course, also centers in Ashkenaz of Rashi and Tosfos at the same time. But in Spain, the Jewish centers were much greater in number, much more powerful in terms of wealth and political connection. And it was really an amazingly prosperous time for the Jewish people in the golden age of Spain. And that produced many great Jewish thinkers and great Rabbonim. And one of them was Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. Now, we don't really know Rabbi Yehuda Halevi so much from his Torah writings. He's unique a little bit in that sense. Most of the great Rabbonim, Gedolim, the Rambam, the Ritva, the Rashba, all these people we know from their Chidushei Torah. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi was unique that he was really, in essence, a poet. We know him from many of the kinnos and many of the slichas that we say. And in addition, many of the zemiras we say at the Shabbos table, a lot of the sacred poetry that has accompanied Klal Yisrael over the last 800 years. Every time you sit at the Shabbos table and you sing Yom Shabboson, Ein Lishkoyach, Zichro Koreach, Hani Chayach, I won't sing it for you, but I think you get the general idea. If you look at the acrostic of the paragraphs, Yom Shabboson is the Yud, Hayom Nichbod Livnei Emunim is the acrostic reads Yehuda, right? Yud Hey Vov Dalad Hey, right? The last paragraph, Ha'om Asher No Katzain Ta'ah, right? The Yehuda is Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi of 800 years ago, who really bequeathed to us some magnificent texts, also in Kiddush, in Tzion, Halo Tishalid, Shlom Asirayich, lots of the kinnos about Yerushalayim, and but he wrote one major philosophical book called the Kuzari, and that book, the Sefer Kuzari, was actually written in Arabic to get as wide a readership as possible. He was writing for an Arabic-speaking audience. But that book was a bombshell sefer in its time. Of course, as you can understand, we're still talking about many centuries before printing, so it wasn't circulated quite as much at that time as it was later on. Once you get into the 16th century and you get into printing, then the Kuzari becomes much more well-known. Apologies, I usually remember to turn off my phone, but today I forgot. Okay, it's now off. Once printing starts, so the Kuzari becomes more well known, until you reach a spot, for example, by the time you get to the 20th century, the Sefer Kuzari was considered by Rav Kook. Rav Kook speaks about the Sefer Kuzari as Kodesh Kadosh, as really one of the cornerstones of all the writings of Rav Kook. Whatever you've heard and read about Rav Kook, he draws extensively on the writings of the Kuzari and the philosophy of the Kuzari. And the Sefer Kuzari, I'm not going to spend the whole shir dealing with the Sefer itself. One could spend many shiurim on it. Indeed, I've given courses of shiurim on the Kuzari. But one thing is very fascinating about the Kuzari is that he has a unique approach to understanding the development of Klal Yisrael, the uniqueness of the Jewish people. And he developed really a school of thought which laid the foundations later on in the 16th, 17th century for the writings of the Mekubalim, the Kabbalist thinkers, like the Arizal, and Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, and Moshe Cordovero, who were all writing in the 16th century. The pattern of ideas that they were expressing was not based on people like the Rambam and Rashi and Tosfos. It was, in a sense, much more in accordance with the writings of the Kuzari, who highlighted the uniqueness of the Jewish people, the uniqueness of mitzvahs, right? He took certain anti-rationalist points of view. In other words, he took the point of view that really the mitzvahs are particularly and uniquely designed to connect us to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but there aren't really rational ways of understanding the mitzvahs. The mitzvahs have to be understood in terms of connections to God. He also, in his Kuzari, he gives us a particularly interesting account of the question that we are looking at today, which is, who was Avraham Avinu? How did Avraham Avinu become who he became? Because as we saw last week, once you start reading about Avraham Avinu, which is chapter 12 in Bereshis, at the beginning of Parshas Lech Lecha, we find Avraham Avinu at the age of 75. He's 75 years old, and he's getting his first nevuah. But how did he become the man he became? At the age of 75, he's already a man of spiritual stature to such a degree that he's hearing the voice of God. He's a Novi, right? And he's able to start having his 10 tests, right? And when he meets the Hittites, they say to him, Nasi Elokim ato b'serchenu. You are a prince of God. But how did he get there? The story of the history of Avraham Avinu, that is a very fascinating subject which the Chumash itself does not deal with. And therefore, it's up to the Rishonim and the great Torah thinkers of all the centuries to weave together a sort of a tapestry, a pattern, drawing from all the Midrashim and the Gemaras which speak about this subject, and to give us a picture. What I'm going to look at today is a text from the Kuzari, but before I do that, I'm going to show you two psukim, which we've looked at before, but these two psukim are the foundations of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's philosophy. I'm going to try doing a screen share here. Okay, that didn't work. Just 1 second. Bear with me for 1 minute. Rabbi Sai, ladies and gentlemen, for some reason. Right. Okay. Okay. Can you see your screen? Yes? Good. Thank you. Okay, here's the question we're going to be looking at in today's Shia. Who really was Avraham Avinu? Right? And particularly, I'm going to look at two ways to understand Avraham Avinu. and that is the Kuzari versus the Rambam. And you'll be amazed to know that actually this dispute of the Kuzari versus the Rambam, which revolves around understanding the genesis of Avraham Avinu, how he came to be the person he was, also actually is a discussion and two schools of thought about the essence of what is unique about the Jewish people. The essence of Judaism really is given a different perspective from these two writings. So before we go into the text of the Kuzari is really based on two questions in the text, both of which we've touched on in previous shiurim, but I'd like to join the dots here in a particular way and ask these questions and have them fresh in your mind so that we can understand what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is doing in his brilliant presentation. The first question was, who are the Binay Elohim? Now, this is a most extraordinary question in the text because it appears here in Bereshit chapter 6, right? It's the closing psukim of Parshas Bereshit, where the pasuk is now going to tell us why God decided to bring the flood. What triggered off the Mabul? What really was the last straw that broke the camel's back, after which HaKadosh Baruch Hu decided, that's it, mankind has no hope anymore. Emche, I'm going to destroy the whole of the human race, with the exception of Noach, and with him we'll start again. But look at these psukim, and look, a phrase appears here twice, which doesn't appear anywhere else in the Chumash. It speaks about Vayiru, this is a highlighted pasuk in the text in front of you, Vayiru Binay Elohim, es benos ha'odom ki tovos heina, vayikchu lehem noshim mikol asher b'choru. So the translator here translates Binay Elohim as the divine beings. Now, any translator here has a dilemma about how to describe this, and you'll notice that in the English translation, which is actually taken from the Safaria online library, he translates, usually when he speaks about God, he uses the word divine with a capital D to refer to God. But here it's divine without a capital D, because it's not referring to God. And here's an interesting thing about the word Elohim in the whole Chumash, because the word Elohim in the Chumash often refers to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Vayidaba Elokim El Moshe Leimor. So when Elokim refers to God, we say Elokim, so as not to say the Shem Hashem properly. But often we find at the other end of the spectrum that the pagan gods are referred to as Elohim Acherim, right? Vayelchu vayavdu Elohim Acherim, right? To go and serve other gods. So the word Elohim sometimes is Kodesh and sometimes it's Chol. There aren't many words like this in the Torah, but this is one of them. Occasionally, the word Elohim actually refers neither to God nor to pagan gods, but refers to the Sanhedrin, refers to the Supreme Court. And it comes from the fact that the root of the word Elokim is the word El, Aleph Lamed. And the word Aleph Lamed in Lashon HaKodesh simply means power of different sorts, right? So we say Elokeinu, Elokei Avosenu. We speak about Elokim as our God, as being the source of all powers in the world and the origin of all life. And that's when we say Elokim, referring to God. But here it can't be that this is a reference to God, because it says Binay Elohim. So Binay Elohim means the children of God. So what could that possibly mean, the children of God? In the Torah, it doesn't really have any real sense to it, the children of God. In one sense, all human beings are the children of God, in the sense that, of course, God participates in the creation of life with a capital L, right? And as the Gemara in Niddah says, there are three partners in the creation of any child, the father, the mother, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So in a sense, Binay Elohim simply means human beings, are all children of God. But clearly here, Binay Elohim is a reference to a particular group of individuals. And what the Pasuk here is saying is that the Binay Elohim were driven to distraction by the beautiful women. So the beginnings of the spiritual deterioration which led to the flood, or not maybe the beginnings, the last straw which caused the flood was promiscuity to a high degree, but particularly promiscuity among a particular group of people. And that's the group of people called the Binay Elohim. So really this pasuk reads, if I paraphrase it, Vayiru Binay Elohim as Benos Elohim Hema means even the Binay Elohim, right? Who were a group of people from whom we expected a spiritual life, even they were led astray by the temptations and the seductions of the beautiful women in the world, and therefore there was no one left. So in a sense, the Binay Elohim represented a unique group of people, and we're going to see in the Kuzari what he does with that. The next pasuk says, as a result of this, Vayomer Hashem, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to himself, Lo yodon ruchi ba'odam la'olam. I'm not going to wait forever for mankind. V'hoyu yomov me'av esim shana. I'm going to give them another 120 years. In other words, I'm going to give them 120 years, maybe to do tshuva, to turn their life around. And indeed, those were the 120 years which, according to Chazal, Noach took for building the ark. And during that time, he was trying to get mankind to do tshuva unsuccessfully. And then the next pasuk says, even more, if you like, strange, Hanafilim hoyu ba'aretz. Who exactly were the Nephilim, we don't know exactly, but they were also people of great power by Yamim Mahaim. V'an gam achrei kein asher yovo, and here it comes again. B'nei Elohim el benos ha'odam. These B'nei Elohim, this group, so you must, for the time being, just understand B'nei Elohim are a particular group of individuals alive in the pre-Mabul world, the antediluvian world before the flood. And they were finally also fell into a promiscuous and immoral life. So that's the first question which we're going to put on the table today. And the question is, who were these B'nai Elohim? That's the first question. The second question that the Kuzari is interested in is, who were the sons and daughters? Now, here's an interesting thing, also a major theme in the beginning of the Chumash and Sefer Bereshis. What does it mean when the Torah makes a very generic statement about bonim ubonos? Bonim ubonos, sons and daughters. But without any descriptions, without any names, without any qualifications of any sort, a general concept of sons and daughters. So let's have a look at a few psukim in Bereshis chapter 5. So it starts off by saying, Zeh Sefer Toldos Odom. So we know about the creation of man already in chapter 1 and chapter 2, when God creates Adam and Chava. But now they've been through, Adam and Chava have been through the Eitz Hadas, they've been thrown out of Gan Eden, they've had Cain and Hevel, we've had the whole Cain and Hevel drama in chapter 4, and now in chapter 5 it again repeats, seemingly unnecessarily, that Adam and Chava were created B'Tselem Elokim, in the image of God. So look at this text. Their Sefer told us Adam. This is the record of Adam's line, Adam's descendants. Biyom baro Elokim Adam bidmus Elokim osos. And here it's not Elohim, it's Elokim, because it's referring to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The man is created B'Tselem Elokim, in the image of God. And here the Pasuk is repeating what we know already from chapter 1 and chapter 2. that the human being is created in the image of God. Why is it being created here? Why is it being said here again? So here comes a very important point. The only reason why it mentions it again, because now it says, Vayechi Adam. Vayechi Adam shloshim uma'as shana. When Adam was 130 years old, Vayoled bidmuso katalma. He gave birth to a child who was in his. So what does it mean, bidmuso katalma? Bidmuso katalma is the way the Torah describes Adam and Chava of being created, but Tselem Elokim and Bidmuso Elokim, meaning the spiritual uniqueness which set man aside from the animal kingdom. The animal kingdom was also created with a nefesh. They were created with a life and a life force and a life energy and the ability to procreate life. All that is part of the animal world. But what set man aside from the animal world was the Tselem Elokim. And now it says that Adam, so in the first pasuk it said that Adam was created with a Demus Elokim. Now it says he gave birth to a child, B'Demuso Katalbo, Vayikra Shemo Sheis, and he calls him Sheis. Right, we've spoken about this in previous shia. This Hebrew word Sheis, Shin Taf, means the foundation. Right? If you speak to an architect, he will tell you that before he starts building a building, he builds the tashtit. The tashtit is the infrastructure upon which the house is built. So the sheis is the foundation, and he indeed is the foundation in the sense that all of mankind comes now from the third son of Adam. Okay, so just to recap for a minute, the three sons, Cain turns out to be a murderer, Hevel turns out to be the victim, and Sheis is going forward the father of mankind, and he is created B'Demuso B'Talmo in the spiritual image of his father. But now look at this final pasuk here. After he'd given birth to Sheis, how long did Adam Rishon still live? Shmone Meos Shana. He lived 800 years. And this is actually beyond our comprehension completely. And these sort of ages, 800 years. What do you do on a Monday morning if you know you're going to live another several centuries? How do you fill your life with meaningful and purposeful activity? He lived 800 years, and presumably he had many wives, right? And what does the pasuk say? Vayoled bonim uvonos. And he had sons and daughters. Bonim uvonos. And the question is, who are these bonim uvonos? And why are they mentioned here? What does it mean? So just think about the sentence, what is being said here. Point number one, Adam is created b'tzelem Elokim. Point number two, he has one son, Sheis, who is Kidmuso B'Talmo, who also has that Tzelem Elokim. And then he has, who knows how many other descendants, who knows what their name were, who knows what happened to them, and who are they? Banim ubanot, sons and daughters, nondescript sons and daughters. Okay, these are the two, if you like, interesting points in the text of Bereshis Chumash, which the Kuzari is now going to develop for us. And here we're going to look at this a little bit more closely. So you can see the dates of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, right? The dates of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is 900 years ago. Right? Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, in a sense, he's living at the same time as Rashi is living in Ashkenaz. He's living in Spain. They didn't know about each other. They didn't read anything from each other. There was no, they weren't on the same WhatsApp group, and they had no way of communicating with each other. The Kuzari was born in Toledo in Spain, and according to tradition, he made it. We know he left Spain to go on Aliyah. We don't actually know for certain that he arrived in Israel, but there are various documents, particularly ones they found in the Geniza of Cairo, which refer to Yehuda Halevi arriving in Egypt on his way to Israel. But we don't know how he died or when he died. And as far as I know, we have no kever, we have no burial spot for Yehuda Halevi in Israel, which is very sad because a lot of his poetry and a lot of his writings speak so passionately about his love for Israel, right? Libi b'mizrach, right? Anochi b'maro v'libi b'mizrach. That is Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, right? And in fact, the song that became famous, Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, right? A lot of the words of that song are lifted, cut and pasted out of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's poetry and his love for Israel. L'chol shirayich ani kinor is a line from Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, right? It was adapted and used after the 6-Day War in that magnificent song of Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, which again I will not sing for you, but the Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's words are really the raw material out of which centuries of poets have expressed their love for Israel and their desire for the land of Israel and their passion for Israel, which was really a central part of his life. And funnily enough, in the Kuzari, in the book of the Kuzari, the very end of the Kuzari, so Rabbi Yehuda Halevi the book of the Kuzari is a dialogue. I'll just mention that. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, the whole Kuzari book is a dialogue between the Chacham, the Talmud Chacham, who is Rabbi Yehuda Halevi himself, and the king of the Kuzars, who wants to know what Judaism is about. And the whole book, he explains in great detail what the beliefs and the principles and Jewish life and Judaism is all about. And at the end of the book, there's only one question that the Kuzari king asks him, which he can't answer. He can answer everything. He can answer all the philosophical questions, the halachic questions, the biblical, the historical questions. He can answer everything. At the end of the book, the Kuzari, the king of the Kuzars, the non-Jewish king of the Kuzars, asks him, so tell me, if Israel is such an important place for you, what are you doing in Spain? Why haven't you gone to live in Israel? And on that, he says, you have caught me with a question to which I have no answer. I cannot tell you why I'm not in Israel, but I'm not. And indeed, most of the Jewish people aren't. Of course, generally speaking, the answer was it simply was not possible to travel there, and it was dangerous, and life was impossible at the time. You know, it was actually in his lifetime, it was Jerusalem was the Crusaders had taken over Jerusalem, and they were hostile to the Jewish community. The Jewish community was slaughtered and impoverished and plague-ridden, and life was not. There was no nefesh b'nefesh, you understand, at the time to oil the wheels and ease the way of people coming in Aliyah. But in a moment of brutal honesty, the Chacham in the Kuzari, Sefer Kuzari in the end says, you have found my weak spot. I do not know an answer to this question about why I am not in Israel. So ladies and gentlemen, we are all able to say that 900 years later, we are descendants of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, and we have fulfilled for him his greatest dream of his life. And by doing so, we are, in a sense, descendants of honor that he would be proud of, that we managed to come here. Whether he managed to come here or not, we don't know. It's still mysterious. We have no documents, but it seems that he did. But sadly, he probably didn't live long. Most of the people who came to Israel at that period did not live long. They came to Israel, which was a place which was not a place, it wasn't a segula for Arichus Yomim at that time to come to the land of Israel. Whether it was Crusaders, or whether it was Arabs, or whether it was plagues, or whether it was a poverty, or whatever it was, the people who came there didn't last long. I can give you a whole list of Gedolei Yisrael who came to Israel in earlier times, including Rav Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, who came in like 1704 or something, and he died the next year. The Or HaChaim HaKadosh also came and died within a year or two. The Ramban came to Israel and died within a year or two. It was not possible to live in Israel at that time. There were no living and the Rambam arrives in Israel, looks around, and the Rambam, who was the supreme rationalist and doctor and concerned about the material and physical conditions of life, took one look around and said, this is the Eretz HaOvos, the land of great sanctity, but I'm going to live in Alexandria because there the Jews can live safely and healthily. And because of that, we have all the writings of the Rambam. If the Rambam would have stayed in Israel, who knows what would have happened. So going to Israel at that time was exceptionally hazardous. It's difficult to overstate how hazardous and dangerous it was. And indeed, I think most of the people who went there knew that it was, in a sense, a little bit of a suicide mission. So bear that in mind, ladies and gentlemen, next time the Misrad HaPanim drives you crazy, and the next time your travel agent or estate agent drives you round the bend, or somebody makes life hard for you, or the neighbors are bashing on your ceiling, or doing whatever happens, bear in mind the thousands of Yidden who came to Israel knowing that they couldn't live there. They just wanted to spend their last few days in the land of Israel. And in that list is also Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, sadly. But he does make that last journey, and it's very, there's a lot of pathos at the end of the Kuzari, Sefer Kuzari, where he speaks about his sadness that he had at the point when he wrote that book, he had never yet managed to make that trip. Okay, let's go back to the text for a second, because we're looking today at Avraham Avinu. So he said, let's read a few lines here from the Kuzari. I haven't got a translation for you. You'll have to work a bit hard for the next few minutes. So he writes as follows. I'm going to highlight the text as I read it. Ki ha'adam ha'yosholeh mibilti tanai. Adam here means not man in general, but Adam HaRishon. When man was created initially, he was created perfect. V'hu asher kibel ha'nefesh ad tumah. First of all, he got a nefesh, meaning a perfectly functional living body, and v'haseichel al hatachlis mashi b'cholos ha'enoshi, and the greatest possible intellect that a human being can possibly have, right? And then, and here comes one of the unique features of the book of the Kuzari and Rabbi Halevi, and then he says, v'hakoach ha'eloki achar haseichel. And he had something else, not just the body and the mind, but he had something that we normally call maybe the neshama, right? But that word neshama and the idea of the neshama being something beyond the body and the mind is here in the Kuzari in the most emphatic way. The koach eloki, look at this phrase here, it's a magnificent phrase. HaKoach eloki asher achar haseichel. The spiritual component of the human being beyond the seichel, beyond the intellect, right? Ritzoni loma, what do I mean by that? So he realizes that that's not a straightforward thing to say. So he says, Ritzoni loma, what do I mean? I mean hamayla, meaning that quality, asher bo yidbak be'elokim u'beruchni, through which we can achieve yidbak, through which we, human beings, can achieve deveikut. We can achieve a strong connection. We can connect to Elokim Boruchriim, to God and the spiritual world, right? V'yeda ho'amitos b'li limud, and we can understand the truths of the spiritual truths b'li limud, without going through the logical arguments and the logical proofs. Without logic, we understand what we would call today a spiritually intuitive understanding. In other words, an immediately intuitive understanding of spiritual truths. And by saying this, Kuzari is already laying the groundwork for a large part of his philosophy, which is that our connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of course, requires us to have a healthy body and a clear mind, but actually we don't connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu either through our physical body or through our intellect. And this put him at odds with the tradition of the Rambam, who took the view that we do connect to God through our intellect. Right? The Kuzari writes, Rabbi Levi writes, we don't connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu through our intellect. We connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu through our spiritual intuition. Through our neshama, we can sense the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We can sense that davening to HaKadosh Baruch Hu is a meaningful activity. We can sense that the world we live in is not an empty world, but it's the world of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We can sense Shavisi Hashem Lenegdi Samid is not something which we can arrive at. According to Rabbi Levi, you can't, let me just put this clearly. According to Rabbi Levi, you can't arrive at emunah through intellectual arguments. That is really one of the themes of his book, one of the themes that Rav Kook really took very profoundly. Our intellect can help us learn Torah and make decisions about how to live, but the essence of our emunah, the essence of our sense of living in God's world, right, and davening to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and being aware that HaKadosh Baruch Hu looks after us and responds to us, what we call hashgacha, all that, he says, is not in our intellect. Logic and intellect and philosophy won't deal with that. That's got to do with what he calls ha'inyan ha'eloki, which we would call the neshama, which is an inner spiritual essence which connects us to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And here comes the important bit, and that is unique to Am Yisrael. The non-Jewish world do not have that. This is what he's going to say. The non-Jewish world have got the seichel, they have the intellect, and with the intellect, when it's used properly, can get you very far. It can prove to you that there is a creator and that there is a God, but the connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, l'hitchaber, right? The connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, or the Torah calls devekus, what modern Hebrew calls l'hitchaber. The connection, that connection can only come through the neshama. This debate, in a sense, between the Kuzari and the Rambam, we'll be doing some Rambam later on, but this debate is a little bit connected to what in the modern world is referred to as the right-hand side of the brain versus the left-hand side of the brain. Right? This distinction I find very, very fascinating. A lot's been written about it. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Zechron Livracha, used to draw on this distinction very frequently, especially the beginning of his book, The Great Partnership. And so what he speaks about is that the left-hand side of the brain is what we call the intellect. It deals with texts and ideas and analysis and concepts and numbers. And the left-hand side of the brain is the brain we use when we are doing science, when we're doing philosophy, even when we're doing Gemara. We are understanding the structure and the ideas. The right-hand side of the brain is the facility to use intuition. It's got to do with music. It's got to do with aesthetics, with harmony, with love, and with spiritual emotions. The spiritual and moral emotions are seated in the right-hand side of the brain, not in the left-hand side of the brain. And this connection between the right and the left-hand side of the brain is a very, very fascinating subject. And I'm not going to go into the great length at the moment, except to say that for Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, the essence of our emunah, you the brain up to a point intellectually, but essentially it comes from our, what he calls ha'inyan ha'eloki achar ha'seichel, the neshama, which is beyond logic and it's beyond intellect. That neshama is a powerful inner sense of our emunah, and that is that's what he's referring to here. Okay, so he says, paragraph 2, right? The text again, yes. See some text, Adele? Yes, thanks, Dina. Ukva nikra etzleinu ben Elohim. Look at this. For the first time, the Kuzari is telling us, he assumes that you know those psukim that we learned 10 minutes ago, the reference to Binay Elohim at the end of Parshas Bereshis, and he says, these people were called Binay Elohim. What does it mean? So he says, Hadomim lo mizaro Binay Elohim, and all those descendants of Adam Harishon who had this neshama are referred to as Binay Elohim, meaning what? They are living a spiritual life because they've got this additional chip. They've got this chip in their mind. They've got this SIM card in their mind, which enables them to connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that's the Binay Elohim. But look what he's saying here. V'holid, but in addition to Binay Elohim, you know what happened? V'holid bonim. Psukim we just learned a few moments ago, that in addition to the Binay Elohim, what was there in this world? There was bonim ubonos, nondescript men and women. V'lo hoyo mehem ro'ui lios bimkom odom elaheva. Nobody was a real spiritual continuation of Adam Harishon except Hevel. Right? In other words, there were lots of bonim ubonos, right? Bonim ubonos, but only Hevel. Why? Kihu hoyodomel. He was the first human being to be similar to Adam Harishon in the sense that he had this neshama. But look at Kasha Harogo Kayin Ochit, when Kayin killed him, and here he gives us an interesting little bit of Chumash commentary, which, to the best of my knowledge, none of them are forshim on the page of Bereshis chapter 4 gives us. Why did Kayin kill Hevel? The battle between Kayin and Hevel was about what? Was about the fact that Hevel had a tzelem Elokim and Kayin didn't. Kayin endowed with that neshama. And then Hevel was killed because of that jealousy. And what happened then? Nosan loy tachtov sheis v'hoyadom el Adam. Then HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave a third son to Adam Rishon called Sheis, and he was Dom el Adam. How does the Kuzari know that? Because of the pasuk we saw just before. Pasuk here. Vaychi Adam shloshim ashana vayoled bidmuso ketzalmo vayikru shmo Sheis. For the first time, not for the first time, but the second time. For the second time, for the first it was Hevel, and Hevel was killed. For the second time, he gave birth to a child who was a human being with the full spiritual capacity. And that was Sheis. And this, says the Kuzari, is the, so he says here, Sheis, he then becomes, look at this language here, that Sheis becomes the segula and the leiv, he becomes the heart and the nucleus of mankind, v'zuloso keklipa, and the rest of mankind were like a klipa. What is a klipa? Anybody know what a klipa is? Klipa is the shell, the peel, right? Around the outside, which actually doesn't have any of the qualities of the fruit, right? And actually, this is a word later on picked up by the Kabbalists of people, human beings who are not involved in the spiritual life, are like a clipper. In other words, they're not. What does it mean, a clipper? It means they are not fulfilling God's purpose in the creation of the world. Usgulas Sheish Enosh, and guess what? Sheish also had lots and lots of children. With Sheish, it also says, I haven't brought you the pasuk here. With Sheish, it also says he lived many centuries and he had boni mubonos, and then he had one son called Enosh. And Enosh is the only named son. Why is he named? Because he's the only one with a neshama. Chaim, he says Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, Higia ha'inyan ad Noach. And this continued until Noach, biyechidim hoyu levavos, in each generation. Don't forget, there are 10 generations from Adam to Noach. In each one of those generations, there were only yechidim, a handful of people, who were the heart of mankind. Domim la'adam. They were spiritually comparable to Adam Rishon. And here comes the vort, which is crucial to this whole understanding. V'nikroim Binay Elohim. And they are the Binay Elohim. So basically, he's given us now a new pshat in the pasuk. When the pasuk says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu saw that the Binay Elohim were becoming corrupted and starting to live a promiscuous life, is that a reference to? It's reference to this handful. If you imagine a world populated by many thousands or tens of thousands of human beings who were, in a certain way, prehistoric man, right? He's got his own, like the anthropologists and the archaeologists have got this idea of Neanderthal men, right? Neanderthal men who were similar to apes, similar to primates, right? So we generally consider the theories. This is actually an interesting point. That generally speaking, I think Rabbonim consider the theories of archaeologists and anthropologists to be anti-Torah, because we think of Adam and Noach and Shem. I don't know why I was muted. Maybe I said something wrong. Okay. I'm no longer muted. You're pleased to know I'm back online. I've always thought this very fascinating. You read all sorts of, every kid goes to school, every boy and girl goes to school and to university, and you're fed the line of secular anthropologists. First, there was the Neanderthal men who were basically apes and monkeys, and then slowly the primates developed a little bit of intelligence. They became hunters, gatherers, and slowly it developed into the human being. Now, from a Torah point of view, most of that idea is completely false, because our view is that the idea of a tzelem and a kin started Adam Harishon. That from the very beginning there were human beings who were fully intellectually and spiritually developed. But Rabbi Yehuda Nossi is telling us is that nevertheless there is still some truth to this thesis, that there were Neanderthal men who were actually simply monkeys in a certain way, right? Because in every generation, there was only a handful of people who had a neshama, and the rest were bonim ubonas, were spiritually irrelevant. They were part of the animal world. So next time you read about the Neanderthal men, think about Rabbi Yehuda Nossi, who in a certain funny way, of course, he's many centuries before any archaeology and anthropology, but he's giving us a conceptual framework within which we can understand that when they dig up the bones of a human being that actually looks like a monkey, that could well be a Neanderthal person who lived in the early prehistoric times, who was really part of the bonim ubonos. Millions of human type people are running around who weren't really endowed with a tzelem elokim. They weren't really endowed yet with the neshama. There was only a handful of people. What happens then is, even that handful of people, even that Binay Elohim, they deteriorate. And when that happens, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, that's it. There's no hope left anymore for mankind, because these are the only people who are fulfilling the purpose, spiritual purpose of the world. And then he brings the flood. So only Noach and his children are deemed able to continue this thread of Binay Elohim, and right. So he says, and I hear he makes it, and I'll just finish off with this very interesting last point that he makes here, which is very interesting and has quite a bit of contemporary relevance. He says, the Efsha Shahayo Mehem Mishalo Dovak Bo in Yanelakim Keterach. Let's for a minute think about Terach. Terach, the father of Avraham Avinu, who lived a pagan life, an immoral life. So we would say about him that he didn't have the Inyanu Eloki functioning within him, right? So then he wants to know, how then did he give birth to Avraham Avinu? How is it possible for someone who doesn't have a neshama to give birth to somebody who does have a neshama? He seems to be dealing with this particular question, right? And we know that Terach, right, in our Seder night, we say, Mitchila ovdi avodah zara hayu avosenu, Terach avi Avraham, right? From the beginning, our ancestors were pagans. It's an extraordinary thing to say on Seder night. I've got a whole shir on that. Why do we say on Seder night that we are descended from pagans? In other words, the ancestry of Klal Yisrael is actually not something wonderful. It isn't who your yichus is. It's a question of what you do with it. So Avraham Avinu becomes the great spiritual leader of Klal Yisrael and of the world, even though he says he was a son of Terach, who didn't have the Inyan Elokim. Avol, he says, Avol, Avraham Beno, so he says, but Avram, his son, right? Hoyo Talmid. Here's an interesting thing, which I remember clearly mentioning it here in the shir before. That Avram Avinu, and here comes the important point, Hoyo Talmid la'avi oviv ever. That Avram Avinu became a disciple of his Alter Zayda. He had a great-grandfather called Aver, Ayin Beis Reish, who was the great-grandson of Noach. Va'od shehisig Noach ba'atzma. Avram Avinu even overlapped his life with Noach. So Avram, according to the Kuzari, Avram Avinu chose to pursue the wisdom of Noach, Shem, and Aver. And indeed, we find in Rashi, quoting Chazal, that Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, each of them had a connection to Beis HaMedrash of Shem and Aver, that they will learn Torah from Shem and Aver. So he says that indeed Avram was born from Terach, but then he went in search of the truth, and he learned from Aver and from Noach. And then he says, so he received his neshama, so to speak, not from his father, but from his Alter Zayda. And therefore, so in a sense, he says it's not necessarily a linear inheritance, the neshama, but the more importantly, he says the having a neshama is, if you like, a potential that can lie dormant within a person for many years, and indeed can lie dormant in a family for generations, until Avram Avinu decides to activate it. But Avraham, he says, Segulas Eva v'Talmido, Al-Kei Nikra Ivri. I mentioned this to you in an earlier shir, that Avram is called Avram or Ivri because Ivri comes from the word Aver, and Aver is the name of his Alter Zayda. And he got his neshama, so to speak. He got his spiritual guidance from Aver, and that's why he called himself Avram or Ivri. Right? And then the Aver So basically, what is he trying to do here? Now, with this, we'll finish for today. What he's saying is as follows. He said, Avraham Avinu was born into paganism. He was born into a pagan family, but something within him made him want to search out the MS, and he went to search out his great-great-great-grandfather, Aver, and he also knew Shem and Noach. And from them, he got the neshama. In other words, they activated, so to speak, his neshama in him, and that's Avraham Avinu. And where did Noach get it from? Noach got it from a direct descendant from Adam HaRishon. So just to summarize for a second, the picture that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is drawing for us is that when man was created initially, you shouldn't think the world was populated by fully developed human beings. That wasn't the case. The world was populated by human type people, but in each generation, there was only a very small handful of people who had developed their neshama, their moral and spiritual and emunah, the side of their mind and their heart, and they lived a life of the neshama. That was only a very small group, and they were the Binay Elohim, right? And that continued through Noach, Shem, Aver, and then Avraham. And he wants to make the point that it can sometimes skip generations. The neshama can be in the Alter Zayda, and then you can have a couple of generations of Chilonim. You can have a couple of generations of pagans, but it's still there in the, if you like, in the potential of the human beings to be activated should they want to activate. Right? And that is really an idea which was picked up later on in the writings of Kabbalah and Hasidus, that when you meet a member, you meet somebody, even if they are in the here and now, living a secular, materialistic, even pagan life, you should know they still have within them a spark, a potential spark. And if one can, right, the pintala, what do they used to call it? The pintala, right? The pintala yid is that little bit of the potential neshama which remains in every individual. He's going to say later on that after Matan Torah, every member of Klal Yisrael, man and woman, has that neshama built in, right? It just has to be activated. But after Matan Torah, the Ummos HaOlam don't have that anymore. That's what he writes. He says they can achieve up to a certain point. They can lead a moral and spiritual life, but unless they convert into Am Yisrael, they will never have that Inyano Elokhi completely. So in a certain sense, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is not so politically correct in the sense that he does have certain ethnic uniqueness for Klal Yisrael, but on the other hand, he does speak very specifically about individuals who are not exhibiting spiritual and moral signs being able to be reactivated. If they meet somebody who is able to activate and light up that spark, they use the Mishnah, which we say, some people have the minhag of saying Friday nights, Bameh Madlikin. What does Bameh Madlikin mean? In the writings of the Hasidus, Bameh Madlikin means how do you ignite the spark in people who have forgotten or who never knew what the spark of the neshama was all about. Bameh Madlikin. And now we're coming up to Hanukkah, like Lahadlik Ner Shel Hanukkah. Lahadlik is to ignite a spark in somebody else, in other people. And that we'll learn a little bit about Hanukkah together. But that's it for today. I hope you've enjoyed Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. 900 years later, his ideas are still very powerful for us. And please God, next week, Tuesday, this Shir will be coming to you from Gush Etzion. Please God. Be coming to you from Efrat. And you're all welcome to come and visit us. I'll give you details.